There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. But the sign of that covenant that God and Abraham made was circumcision. That was the sign of this covenant. And it was the sign for all of his descendants, because there were other nations that practiced circumcisions. But their rituals, they didn't carry the spiritual significance like Israel's did. And anyone not circumcised would be cut off from Israel. And so you might think, well, maybe they didn't have time to circumcise the babies while wandering in the wilderness. Maybe it's because they were traveling, and maybe it wasn't that sanitary. You might think that, but it wouldn't have been true, because they camped at places for long periods of time in some of those areas on their journey. But what I think happened is I think that Israel stopped circumcising their children right after Kadesh Barnea. And it was after Israel refused to follow God and to claim the land because of their unbelief. Were all the Israelite slaves from Egypt, although they were all physically circumcised, they weren't circumcised in their hearts. Their hearts weren't soft toward God. And then even after rejecting God, you can see that God was still very gracious to them, because even after the rejection, God still provided for their food and for their water, and He took care of them in the wilderness. But after that, He was not requiring them to keep His covenant with them any longer. So those people, they stopped circumcising their children. And it's all because Israel rejected God from leading them now. And so then God rejected them. And so after Israel refused to enter the land, no one circumcised their sons. And so they lost this whole generation. And it was like they didn't care anymore, because they knew that they were all going to die in the wilderness. And so you might think, you say, well, does this mean that God hates them and that they won't be in heaven? I don't think that's what that means. I don't think that's what it means at all, because they are loved. They were all saved. They were all baptized in the Red Sea, but they will never receive all that God had for them in this life. And we just last Wednesday at our Wednesday night, we had just read this same thing as a warning to us, that it's these same people that God wasn't pleased with, most of them. And he said, that's a warning for us not to be like them. But we do know that all of Israel was circumcised at the original Passover in Egypt. We also know that all of Israel was circumcised when they received the law at Mount Sinai. And again, they were all still circumcised at the second Passover that they celebrated at Mount Sinai. And that's recorded for us in Numbers chapter 9. But it was after that Passover, and after Israel went to Kadesh Barnea, we never read of another Passover being celebrated by Israel. And the rule was that all males had to be circumcised to eat the Passover. So Israel, they only celebrated 2 Passovers, and that's when I believe they stopped circumcising their children. And so now for 38 years, no one circumcised their sons or celebrated the Passover. And I don't believe it was because they couldn't. I believe it was because they didn't want to, and God wasn't going to make them anymore, because it had to be voluntary. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was exactly 40 years to this date where Israel had left Egypt. They just happened to be in the time of the Passover when they got to the other side of the Jordan. But before they can eat this Passover, all the males are going to have to be circumcised because that is a requirement for the Passover. And you can read those instructions because they're in Exodus 12:49. And it wasn't just a law for just Israelites. It was a law for anyone, native or foreign born, that all the males had to be circumcised. And so the first thing that Israel's to do for them now to be in the land is to restore their covenant relationship with God. Because even though they're all Jews and God has been leading them, they're not in covenant fellowship with God because they no longer have the sign of being God's covenant people. And there is no one else on earth that had this covenant with God, of being God's covenant people. And this is the same covenant which gave Israel the right to the land. And it wasn't done because God needed to prepare the people physically, and he didn't need to prepare them emotionally. The reason the people of Israel needed to be circumcised is because they needed to be prepared spiritually, because it wasn't going to be their military expertise or their emotional stability to cause them to win any of these battles. But the battles will be won because the people have given themselves over completely to God. And you have to see here that God protected Israel here during this time because they were weak from that circumcision. And you can read here that Israel crossed over the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. So the first thing they do is they renew this covenant that they had that was broken with God. And then God tells them that the reproach of Israel is now rolled away. And he calls it the reproach of Egypt. All right, and so there's different ideas what that means. Some people think that's about Israel and them serving the gods of Egypt when they were in Egypt and also in the wilderness. Others believe that it's the reproach of not trusting God at Kadesh Barnea when they were told to enter the promised land. But whatever that reproach was, it is now completely gone. And now here, every man bears that mark of his individual identification with God. And so now God uses this word, galgal, which is the word for being rolled away. And it's a play on words with the name of where they're staying. Gilgal, that's where they're camping. And Gilgal means a circle. Okay, so now with their parents' disgrace removed, and all of Israel, now they're all healing in Gilgal for 3 days, and now they're all qualified to eat the Passover. Because again, Israel is now again God's marked people, where now their bodies belong to the Lord, which means they have willingly put themselves under obligation to obey him, which is different than everybody around them. So Israel is to maintain their purity, and they're not to degrade themselves with sensuality with the idols. And they are once again now God's holy nation. And this is really important to do this before taking the land. Because when they get into the land, they're going to have more temptation to sin than when they were in the wilderness. Because in the land, they're going to be living among these pagan people who are enslaved by their immoral practices. And they're going to be tempted to compromise with their enemies, who happen to be their brand new neighbors. And even though this is just a little physical surgery, it's a symbol of something much bigger. This is a symbol of a spiritual operation that's happened to their hearts. Because all their parents, they were all circumcised physically, but they were never circumcised in their hearts. And what's a real shame is that later on in Israel, the people are going to think that it's the physical difference that made them spiritual. But it wasn't. It was always supposed to be their heart toward God, because circumcision was just an outward sign of what had already happened in their hearts. And this is the same for us. We are never to take our outward signs, things like baptism or taking communion, and ever to think that any of those things save us, because those two are just outward signs, and they're only meant to represent what's already happened in our hearts. So symbols and ordinances, they mean absolutely nothing without conversion. It's always the heart that matters. And so now, as their first act as God's people, Israel, for the first time in 38 years, they're going to celebrate the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, which means they've only been in the land for 4 days. And they never celebrated it in the wilderness. And as they sit down to eat this Passover, what this reminds me of Psalm 23, where it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Because they're going to be eating this Passover in the presence of their enemies, because Jericho is only 2 miles away. And once they start eating this Passover, and they start eating the bread of the land, and that bread was probably barley loaves, and it was unleavened barley loaves, because this is the time of year of the barley harvest. And that barley that they're probably eating, it's probably from the fields of the farmers that grew barley that probably all ran into the city of Jericho for the protection of their walls. But once they began eating this bread in this land, that daily manna, the bread from God, it stopped. And they weren't going to need it any longer. And so now this 40-year miracle is over, and it ends on the very same day as the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And some people, they do think that Israel's march around Jericho coincided with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that's because of all the sevens that are associated with the march. There was 7 priests and 7 trumpets, 7 days, and 7 times around the city. But nobody knows if it was, and it's not necessarily true. But now after this Passover, we have here Joshua, and he's walking around. And he's contemplating, well, how are we going to take Jericho? Because he doesn't have a plan, and he hasn't been given any instructions of what's going to be happening in the next few days. So he's at Jericho, and he sees a man, and he's never seen this man before. And this man, he not only has a sword, but his sword is drawn. And so Joshua, he doesn't immediately think this is a friend. And Joshua, he's alone, and he's probably startled. And we're told here that Jericho is all locked up. And so I would think that he's probably assuming that this man is from Jericho. But before he attacks him, Joshua shows some wisdom, because his initial thought would not be, oh, wow, this is God in human form. He's probably thinking he's going to have to fight this guy. And so he asks him, he says, "Are you a friend or foe?" And the man refuses to answer Joshua's question. And he just says, "No." You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.